I want you to look at the first item in our stack today. It's a faded poster, yellowing paper, from South Africa, and it's dated December 1899. It's a dead or alive notice.
A dead or alive notice. Okay.
Yeah.
And the reward on it is for 25 pounds.
25 pounds.
That doesn't seem like a particularly high value for a human life, even, back in 1899.
It really wasn't. And the description of the fugitive is, well, it's even less flattering. It says, and I'm quoting here, Englishman, 25 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches high, indifferent build, walks with a forward stoop, pale appearance, reddish-brown hair, small and hardly noticeable mustache, talks through his nose.
Tucks through his nose.
And cannot speak a word of Dutch.
Indifferent build. Wow. I mean, that's hardly the description of a historical titan.
Exactly. But this man, at this very moment, is completely alone, 300 miles deep inside enemy territory. He has no map, no compass.
What does he have?
He has 2 bars of chocolate in his pocket and a whole lot of ambition. He's hiding in a mine shaft during the day, literally fighting off rats. And then at night, he's sprinting alongside moving freight trains, trying to haul himself aboard to escape.
It sounds like a scene from an action movie, an Indiana Jones script or something. But this is real. This is the actual lived experience of a young Winston Churchill.
It is. And this moment, this escape from a Boer prison camp, it's the catalyst. It turns him from a captured war correspondent into an international celebrity. It's the moment that launches a political career that will span more than half a century.
But today, in this deep dive, we're not just here to tell that great man's story, are we? We're trying to peel back the layers of the legend.
I don't have to.
You really do. Because with Churchill, the caricature so often obscures the man. We all have that image in our heads, right? The bulldog, the V sign, the cigar, the siren suit. But when you actually dig into the source material we have, the massive biographies by Martin Gilbert, the archives from the Churchill Society, the debates from the London School of Economics, you find a figure who is just so much more complex and often so much more contradictory and deeply, deeply flawed.
We're going to try to look at the whole arc. The lonely Victorian boy, the reckless young soldier, the radical social reformer, which is a side of him people always forget.
Always. The
failed strategist of the First World War, the total outcast of the 1930s, and of course the war leader.
But we're also going to spend a good amount of time unpacking the things that sometimes get glossed over. His disastrous economic policies as chancellor and the very real, very heated controversy surrounding his views on race and his role in the Bengal famine of 1943.
It's a massive life. I mean, he essentially bookends the modern era. He rode in one of the last cavalry charges in history at Omdurman with a sword and a pistol.
Right.
And he ended his career as prime minister in the nuclear age, terrified of the hydrogen bomb.
It's an incredible span of history to live through, let alone to shape.
So let's go back to the start. It's 1874, Blenheim Palace. He's born reportedly 2 months premature. And when you look at his lineage, you'd think he had it made. He's a Spencer Churchill, grandson of a duke.
It looks absolutely perfect on paper. But the reality of his childhood was, well, it was icy. And we really have to understand the psychology here because it drives almost everything he does later in life.
It starts with his father, Lord Randolph Churchill.
Lord Randolph, a political meteor. I mean, Chancellor of the Exchequer at just 37. Right. But as a father, he was an absolute catastrophe.
I was reading some of the letters Lord Randolph sent to Winston when he was just a boy away at school.
They are.
They're brutal.
They're just savage. He treated Winston with this undisguised contempt. He genuinely seemed to believe his son was unintelligent, lazy, a spendthrift. There's this heartbreaking dynamic where you see Winston constantly writing these pleading letters home, begging for a visit, for just a scrap of approval.
And replies.
Lord Randolph either ignores him completely or writes back to criticize his handwriting or his poor grades. It's just cold.
And his mother, Jenny Jerome, she was this dazzling American socialite, a huge celebrity in her own right.
She was the absolute star of the London social scene. And Winston, well, he worshipped her. But as he famously wrote much later, he loved her at a distance.
More like a goddess than a mother.
Exactly. She was this brilliant, distant star in his sky. She was busy with her parties and, to be frank, her numerous lovers. So Winston was effectively an orphan with 2 living parents.
Which explains his incredible bond with his nanny, Mrs. Everest.
Womany, as he called her. She was it. She was the one source of unconditional love and warmth in his life. When she died in 1895, it absolutely devastated him. Yeah. He kept a photo of her on his desk for the rest of his life.
You can see how that lack of parental approval would create this this vacuum in him.
A huge vacuum. He developed this insatiable, lifelong need for applause, for recognition, for glory. He had to prove his father wrong. Even long after his father was dead, he was still trying to prove him wrong.
Speaking of proving people wrong, there's this persistent myth that Churchill was stupid because he struggled so much at school in Harrow.
It's a total myth. He wasn't stupid at all. He was just stubborn. You have to remember the Victorian education system. If you couldn't master Latin and Greek and advanced mathematics, you were basically considered backward.
And Churchill hated Latin.
He refused to learn it. He thought it was pointless. But you put an English book in front of him, history, poetry, he would devour it. He could recite from memory hundreds and hundreds of lines of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. He wasn't unintelligent, he was just interested in other things.
But because of that Latin issue, he gets shoved into what they call the army class.
Which was basically the dumping ground for the boys who weren't considered clever enough for university or a career in law. And even then, even to get into the military academy at Sandhurst, it took him 3 attempts to pass the entrance exam.
And that leads to that famous story about the toy soldiers.
Right. So his father, Lord Randolph, walks into the nursery one day and sees young Winston on the floor playing with this massive army, something like 1,500 toy soldiers, all arranged in perfect tactical formation.
So his father's impressed.
Well, Lord Randolph asks, would you like to go into the army? And Winston just beams, He says yes, thinking his father has finally recognized his strategic genius.
But the reality was something else entirely.
The reality was Lord Randolph was thinking, well, the boy's not smart enough to be a lawyer, so I suppose we'll have to make him a soldier. It wasn't a compliment, it was a dismissal.
So he gets through Sandhurst, he graduates. And then comes 1895. This is a pivotal year. His father dies at just 45 years old.
A truly gruesome death. It was most likely syphilis, though some biographers now argue it could have been a brain tumor. But whatever it was, he essentially died insane. And Winston, who's now just 20, becomes convinced that he, too, is going to die young. He feels this ticking clock. He has to make his mark on the world, and he has to do it immediately.
And so begins the action hero phase.
Yeah.
This guy becomes a medal hunter. He basically starts treating the British Empire's colonial wars as a personal buffet for glory.
He absolutely does. He shamelessly uses his mother's high society connections to get himself posted to wherever the fighting is hottest. He goes to Cuba on his 21st birthday to observe the Spanish fighting the rebels.
And that's where he picks up 2 habits that will define his image for the rest of his life.
The afternoon nap, the siesta, which allowed him to work late into the night, and, of course, the Havana cigar.
From Cuba, he's off to India, the Malacan Field Force.
Right. This is on the northwest frontier, what is now the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. And this was brutal, vicious, hand-to-hand fighting in the mountains. He's deliberately riding a gray pony to make himself a more conspicuous target.
Because he wants the glory?
He wants the glory, but he's also writing about it. That's the key thing to remember. He's sending these vivid dispatches back to the Daily Telegraph in London. He is building his personal brand from day one.
But the real cinematic moment, even before his capture in South Africa, has to be the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, 1898.
Oh, absolutely. This is one of the last great cavalry charges in history.
It's a scene straight out of the Napoleonic Wars, but it's happening in the age of the machine gun.
It's insane. Churchill is a young lieutenant with the 21st Lancers. They spot what they think is a small group of dervished warriors, so they lower their lances, draw their sabers, and charge.
But it was a trap.
A classic, devastating trap. As they gallop over a small crest, they find themselves looking down into a dry riverbed, a khor that is packed with thousands of enemy warriors who've been hiding there. The charge just smashes into this wall of men. It's instant chaos.
And this is where a previous injury actually ends up saving Churchill's life.
Yes. He had a dislocated shoulder from an accident in India, so he knew he couldn't effectively swing a heavy saber. Instead, he armed himself with a brand new Mauser C96 pistol, a semi-automatic.
So while everyone else is hacking with swords,
he's methodically shooting people at point-blank range. She wrote about it later. Shooting a man who was trying to hamstring his horse, shooting another who was about to spear him. He killed at least 3 or 4 men in under 2 minutes. It was just a visceral, bloody melee.
And yet afterwards, he shows this strange humanity. He gave skin from his own chest for a skin graft to help a wounded fellow officer.
He did. And he also publicly criticized his own commander, General Kitchener, for the unmerciful treatment of the enemy wounded after the battle. It's that contradiction again. He loved the thrill, the sport of war, but he seemed to genuinely hate the cruelty of it.
Which brings us full circle back to that Dead or Alive poster. The Boer War, South Africa, 1899.
He goes there as a journalist, but he negotiates this massive salary. At that point, he's the highest paid war correspondent in the world, and he immediately jumps on an armored train that's going to scout the enemy lines.
And the Boers ambush it.
They do. They block the track with huge boulders and open up with artillery and rifle fire.
The accounts of this are just wild. The train driver is terrified, covered in blood, wants to surrender immediately.
And Churchill, who is technically a civilian, just takes over. He starts barking orders, organizing the uninjured men to physically push the derailed truck off the line while bullets are just pinging off the metal all around them. He manages to get the engine free, loads it with all the wounded, and tells the driver to make a run for it.
But he doesn't go with them. He stays behind.
He stays behind to cover the retreat with the remaining soldiers, and he ends up alone in a ditch, looking down the barrel of a Boer rifle. He has no choice but to surrender.
And then the escape. We touched on it in the intro, but the actual mechanics of it are, well, almost comical. He didn't really have a plan.
Not at all. He was being held in a converted school in Pretoria. He just watched the sentries for a few nights and noticed there was a small gap in their patrol pattern, a spot that was briefly unobserved.
So one night he just went for it.
He just went for it, scrambled over the wall. He was wearing a business suit. He had no water, no map, and he just started walking east, vaguely following the railway line, guided by the stars.
He literally just knocked on a random door at one point.
He was starving and exhausted. He saw a light in the distance near a coal mine. He knocks on the door, fully prepared to have to lie or fight his way out. And by just sheer astronomical 1-in-a-million luck, the house belongs to the only Englishman in the entire district, a mine manager named John Howard. If he had knocked on any other door for miles around, he would have been immediately handed back to the Boers. Howard hides him down in the mine in the rat-infested darkness for days until they can smuggle him onto a freight train hidden among bales of wool.
So when he finally gets back to England, he is a superstar.
He is the most famous young man in the British Empire, a household name, and he knows exactly what to do with that fame.
He cashes it in.
Immediately. In the khaki election of 1900, fueled by war patriotism, he wins the parliamentary seat for Oldham. He enters Parliament at just 25 years old.
So now we have Churchill, the politician.
Yeah.
And I think most people, because of who he became later in life, assume he was always this staunch, traditional conservative. But he was actually, well, he was a radical.
He was a political chameleon. He starts as a conservative, yes, but he very quickly realizes he disagrees with them on almost every major issue, especially free trade. The conservatives were moving toward protectionist tariffs. Churchill was a diehard free trader.
So in 1904, he does the unthinkable. He crosses the floor.
Which sounds ceremonial, but it was a huge, dramatic deal. He literally stood up, walked across the central aisle of the House of Commons, and sat down on the benches with the opposition Liberal Party.
That must have been seen as the ultimate act of betrayal.
Oh, they loathed him for it. The conservatives never forgave him. They called him a class traitor, a rat. The hatred was personal and it was intense.
But this liberal phase, this is where he does some of his most important and I think most overlooked work. We tend to think of the British welfare state as a post-World War II creation.
Right, by the Labour government.
But Churchill and David Lloyd George, they built the foundations.
They absolutely did. As president of the Board of Trade and later as Home Secretary, Churchill was genuinely obsessed with the plight of the left-out millions, as he called them. He introduced the first labor exchanges, which were essentially job centers so unemployed men could find work.
And unemployment insurance.
The first national unemployment insurance scheme. He mandated minimum wages in certain industries, statutory breaks for shop assistants. I mean, at this point in his career, Churchill is basically a progressive crusader. He's fighting for the working man.
But he still has that love for the military. And in 1911, he gets his dream job. First Lord of the Admiralty.
He is now in charge of the Royal Navy, the biggest, most powerful navy in the world, and just in the nick of time.
Because he sees what's happening in Germany.
He does. He sees Germany building a massive, modern fleet across the North Sea, and he knows it's a direct challenge. So he pivots instantly from social reform to war preparation. He begins a huge modernization program. He champions the switch from coal-fired ships to oil.
Which was a massive strategic gamble.
Huge. Because Britain had tons of coal, but it had no oil. That single decision essentially forced Britain's strategic involvement in the Middle East, in Persia, for the next century. It all starts there.
He also creates the Royal Naval Air Service. He was obsessed with airplanes.
He took flying lessons himself. His wife, Clementine, was terrified. He was apparently a terrible pilot. He crashed multiple times, and she finally begged him to stop before he killed himself. But he saw the future. He understood years before most generals that air power was going to change warfare forever.
Then, 1914, the First World War breaks out. And initially, Churchill is the golden boy. The fleet is mobilized and ready to go. But then comes 1915, and one word that would haunt him for the rest of his life: Gallipoli.
We really need to unpack this because it's so often misunderstood. The war on the Western Front in France was already a bloody stalemate, trench warfare.
Yeah.
Millions of men dying for a few inches of mud.
So Churchill looked at the map and saw a back door.
Exactly. The Dardanelles, a narrow strait of wire controlled by Germany's ally, Turkey, that led to their capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul.
And the idea was to knock Turkey out of the war and open a vital supply line to Britain's ally, Russia.
Strategically, it was a brilliant idea, a masterstroke, really.
Yeah,
But tactically, it was a complete debacle. Churchill's initial belief was that the Navy could do it alone.
Just sail a fleet of battleships up the straits and blast the Turkish forts into submission.
Yes. But he fatally underestimated the Turkish defenses, and specifically the danger of naval mines.
So the attack begins.
March 18th, 1915, the Allied fleet steams into the straits, and they sail right into a row of undetected mines. Within minutes, 3 massive battleships are sunk or crippled. The naval attack is called off in a panic. So they regroup and decide on Plan B land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula.
But by then, the element of surprise was completely gone.
Totally gone. The Turks, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, had rushed in reinforcements and dug in on the high ground overlooking the beaches.
So when the Allied troops landed,
The Anzares, the British and French soldiers, they landed on those beaches and were just pinned down by machine gun fire. It turned into the very thing they were trying to avoid, trench warfare. But this time it was on steep cliffs, with the added misery of dysentery, heat stroke, and swarms of flies. The casualties were horrific, over 250,000 on the Allied side alone.
and someone had to take the blame.
It all fell on Winston. Now, it wasn't entirely his fault. The admiral on the scene was far too timid, and the army commander was incompetent. But it was Churchill's plan. He was the architect.
And his political enemies saw their chance.
The conservatives, who still hated him for defecting to the liberals a decade earlier, demanded his head as the price for joining a national coalition government. He was forced to resign from the admiralty. He was demoted, humiliated.
This is a devastating low point for him. He goes from basically running the war to sitting in his country house Chartwell, just staring at a blank canvas.
He honestly thought he was finished. He told his wife, "I am finished." He fell into a deep depression, what he called his black dog. But then he does something so utterly characteristic. He doesn't just sit there and write his memoirs.
No. In 1916, he rejoins the army. He puts on a uniform, travels to France, and takes command of a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in the trenches.
Just try to picture that. A former senior cabinet minister, a man who had run the most powerful navy in the world, now 41 years old, living in a rat-infested dugout on the Western Front.
And he wasn't just doing it for show.
Not at all. He led patrols out into no man's land. He was famous for wearing a French steel helmet because he thought it looked more dashing than the British one. He genuinely cared for his men. He organized sports for them. He tried to reduce the lice infestation in the dugouts. In a way, it was his penance. He was washing away the stain of Gallipoli in the mud of Flanders.
He survives the war, he comes back to politics, and eventually in the 1920s, he switches parties again.
Re-ratting, as he rightly called it. He rejoins the Conservatives, and he's rewarded by being made Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924.
And this is where we have to get a little bit technical, because he makes a decision here that is arguably worse than Gallipoli in terms of the scale of human suffering it caused. The gold standard.
Right. And to a modern listener, the gold standard sounds like a good thing. Solid, reliable. Why was it such a disaster?
Churchill, by his own admission, was not an economist. He listened to the so-called experts at the Treasury and the Bank of England, and they were obsessed with returning the pound sterling to its pre-war value relative to gold. Specifically, $4.86 to the pound.
It was a matter of national pride. They wanted the pound to look the dollar in the face again.
But the British economy in 1925 was not the British economy of 1914.
Not even close. By pegging the pound that high, they artificially inflated the cost of all British exports. Overnight, British coal, steel, ships, textiles, everything became 10 to 12% more expensive on the world market than German or American goods.
So nobody bought them.
Nobody bought them. And if you're a mine owner and you can't sell your coal,
You have to cut your costs.
and the only major cost you can cut is wages. So Churchill's decision directly forced the mine owners to slash the miners' pay. This triggered the general strike of 1926. It caused years of unemployment and misery for millions of working-class families. Churchill himself later admitted it was the single biggest mistake of his entire life.
So by 1929, the Conservatives lose the election. Churchill's out of a job. And he enters what would become known as the Wilderness Years, an entire decade out of power.
He was a complete pariah. The political establishment on all sides viewed him as brilliant, yes, but dangerously unstable. A warmonger, an opportunist, an alcoholic, a relic of a bygone era.
But this is the decade where he becomes Cassandra. While the rest of the political world is disarming, talking about everlasting peace, Churchill is standing up in Parliament and screaming about the danger of Hitler.
And this is the really interesting part. How did he know? He wasn't in government anymore? He didn't have access to the official intelligence reports?
He basically ran his own private spy ring, didn't he?
He did. He cultivated a network of sympathetic civil servants and military officers who were terrified by what they were seeing in Germany but couldn't get the government, led by Baldwin and later Chamberlain, to listen.
Men like Desmond Morton.
Exactly. Men like Major Desmond Morton who worked in the intelligence services. They would secretly bring classified documents down to Churchill at his home, Chartwell. Files on German aircraft production, factory output, pilot training numbers.
That's technically treason, isn't it? Passing classified documents to a backbench MP.
Technically, yes. But it gave Churchill the ammunition he needed. So when he stood up in Parliament, he wasn't just guessing. He could say, "The Prime Minister claims Germany has achieved air parity with Britain. I can tell you from sources I trust that their air force is already double the strength of our own." He was right, and the government was consistently wrong.
But nobody listened. Or at least not enough people listened. Not until it was almost too late.
Not until September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, Britain finally declares war, and the Admiralty sends out a simple 3-word signal to the entire fleet. Winston is back.
He comes back as First Lord of the Admiralty, his old job. But he doesn't become Prime Minister immediately.
No, Neville Chamberlain stays on through that strange period of inaction known as the Phony War. But by May 1940, after the military disaster in Norway, it's clear Chamberlain has to go. And this is the moment that history turns on a dime. May 10th, 1940.
Which, with incredible irony, is the very same day that Hitler launches his invasion of France and the Low Countries.
The timing is just cinematic. Now, the king and the political establishment, they didn't want Churchill. They actually wanted Lord Halifax to be the next prime minister. Halifax was seen as safe, steady, predictable, an establishment man. Churchill was still seen as a dangerous wildcat.
So why didn't Halifax get the job?
There was a famous meeting on May 9th, just Chamberlain, Halifax, and Churchill. Chamberlain makes it clear he wants Halifax to succeed him. But Halifax was a peer. He sat in the House of Lords, not the elected House of Commons. He argued, probably correctly, that he couldn't run a total war from the Lords. He needed to be in the Commons, so he declined.
And Churchill just sat there, in silence, until the job fell into his lap.
He let the job come to him, and thank God it did. Because we now know that Halifax, in the coming weeks, would have almost certainly negotiated a peace deal with Hitler. Churchill was the only one whose entire life, whose entire character, had prepared him to fight on no matter the cost.
Let's talk about that moment. May 1940. The situation is apocalyptic. The German blitzkrieg is tearing through France. The French army is collapsing. The entire British army is trapped on the continent with its back to the sea at Dunkirk.
We have to understand just how close Britain came to surrendering. In late May 1940, the War Cabinet was having secret, furious debates about whether to ask Mussolini to act as a mediator and ask Hitler what his terms for peace would be.
And Halifax was pushing for this.
He was. He argued, quite logically, we can probably get better terms now than we will after our army has been destroyed and we are invaded.
Yet on paper, the logic was on his side.
It absolutely was. But Churchill knew that any negotiation from that position of weakness was surrender. And this is where he weaponized the English language. He used his oratory to bulldoze logic.
I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. If you actually listen to the recordings of those speeches or read them, they're written in a specific rhythm. It's iambic. It's almost like Shakespearean blank verse. He was deliberately channeling Shakespeare and the King James Bible
To what end?
to convince the British people and his own cabinet that they weren't the victims of a catastrophic military defeat. They were the protagonists in a heroic drama, that this was their finest hour.
But rhetoric doesn't stop panzer divisions. He needed allies.
He desperately needed the United States, and he spent the next year and a half courting President Franklin Roosevelt. He wrote him hundreds of personal letters, flattering him, cajoling him, begging him for old destroyers, for supplies, for anything. The special relationship, that was Churchill's invention, born of desperation. He knew Britain couldn't win the war alone. They just had to survive long enough for the New World to come to the rescue of the old.
And then, December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the giant finally wakes up. And just months before that, Hitler had made his own fatal error by invading Russia. Suddenly, Churchill has his grand alliance.
The big three: Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. It must have been the most awkward dinner party in history.
Yeah.
Churchill loathed communism. He'd tried to strangle the Bolshevik Revolution in its crib back in 1919.
But he was a pragmatist.
The ultimate pragmatist. He famously said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. He would ally with anyone to defeat the primary enemy.
As the war goes on, though, you can see Churchill's relative power begin to fade.
Yes. By 1943, and certainly by 1944, it's clear that the real superpowers are the U.S. and the USSR. Britain is becoming the junior partner. You see it at the big conferences in Tehran and Yalta. Churchill is fighting to preserve the British Empire and to stop Stalin from swallowing all of Eastern Europe. But FDR is often siding with Stalin against Churchill.
FDR thought he could charm Stalin.
He did. He thought Churchill was an old imperialist and that he, Roosevelt, could build a post-war world based on trust with Uncle Joe. Churchill knew Stalin was a tyrant and couldn't be trusted an inch. On that, Churchill was right and Roosevelt was tragically wrong.
And what about D-Day, the invasion of France?
Churchill was privately terrified of D-Day. He delayed it for as long as he could. For nearly 2 years, he kept pushing for alternative attacks in Italy, in the Balkans, what he called the soft underbelly of Europe.
Why?
Gallipoli, the Somme, Passchendaele. He had the ghosts of the First World War on his shoulder. He couldn't bear the thought of sending another generation of young men to be slaughtered on a beach. He had nightmares about it. But the American generals, Marshall and Eisenhower, they overruled him. They knew the only way to win was a direct assault.
Now, we're in the thick of these war years, and we really need to pause here. Because while Churchill is leading the fight against Hitler, there are other decisions being made and events unfolding that cast a very long, very dark shadow on his legacy.
Yes. We have to do a deep dive into the controversies, specifically his views on race and the Bengal famine.
This is the part of the story that makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable, but you have to face it to understand the whole man.
You absolutely do. We have to remember that Churchill was, first and foremost, a man of the Victorian era. He was an unapologetic imperialist. He genuinely believed in a hierarchy of races, with the white English-speaking peoples at the top, and he believed it was their duty, their burden, to rule over what he called the subject peoples for their own good.
There are some quotes that are just. They're very hard to read today.
They are. The most infamous one is a diary entry from his Secretary of State for India, Leo Amory, who quotes Churchill as saying, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." Now, that quote has become the smoking gun for his critics.
But then at the same time, you have him praising Indian soldiers, calling them the bravest in the world.
Exactly. It's the contradiction again. He admired the Indian army. He thought the Sikh and Gurkha soldiers were noble and brave warriors. It was the Indian political class. He despised people like Gandhi and Nehru. He simply could not understand why they wanted to leave the glorious British Empire. In his mind, the empire was a force for civilization and progress.
Which brings us directly to 1943, the Bengal famine. An estimated 3 million people starved to death in a part of British-ruled India.
This is, right now, one of the most furious historical debates surrounding Churchill. On one side, you have historians like Madhusri Mukherjee, whose book Churchill's Secret War is a powerful indictment.
What's her core argument?
Her argument is that the famine was not a natural disaster, but was man-made, and a direct result of Churchill's policies and his racism. She points out that while people were starving in Bengal, Churchill repeatedly refused to divert shipping from the Atlantic and Mediterranean to bring food relief. She argues that he prioritized building up food stockpiles for a future invasion of Europe over saving living Indian subjects.
She also talks about Britain's denial policy.
Right. Fearing a Japanese invasion of India from Burma, the British Army implemented a scorched earth policy in coastal Bengal. They confiscated and destroyed thousands of local boats and rice stocks to deny them to a potential invader. Mukherjee argues this shattered the local economy and tipped the region into famine.
Okay, so that's the accusation. What is the counter-argument? Because historians like Arthur Herman and others see it very, very differently.
The defense is based on context and logistics. First, they argue the primary causes were beyond Churchill's control. A massive cyclone hit the region, followed by a fungal disease that destroyed a huge portion of the rice crop. Second, and most importantly, the Japanese had just conquered Burma.
And Burma was the rice bowl that normally fed Bengal.
Exactly. Once that massive source of imported rice was cut off, a major food crisis was almost inevitable.
But what about the ships? Did Churchill refuse to send help, as Mukherjee claims?
This is where it gets complicated. We have the telegrams. In early 1944, Churchill himself wrote to Roosevelt, "I am seriously concerned about the food situation in India. By the end of the year, there will be a shortage of wheat." He explicitly asked FDR for American ships to carry wheat from Australia to India.
And what did Roosevelt say?
Roosevelt said no. He replied that every available ship was needed for the war in the Pacific and the upcoming D-Day invasion of Europe. War priorities came first.
So Churchill did ask for help.
He did. And he did eventually appoint a new viceroy, Lord Wavell, specifically to tackle the famine, and the Indian Army was eventually used for mass food distribution. But, and this is the crucial nuance, his critics argue he acted far too late and not forcefully enough. They argued that there were Australian ships carrying wheat past India on their way to the Mediterranean that could have been diverted, but Churchill refused because his focus was 100% on winning the war in Europe.
So to be clear, the argument isn't that this was a genocide, in the sense that he actively wanted millions of Indians to die.
No, absolutely not. That's a false and dangerous equivalence. The argument is that it was a brutal and perhaps racist calculation of wartime priorities. In Churchill's mind, defeating Hitler and the Japanese was the supreme goal. If that meant Indians starved, it was a tragedy, but it was a secondary tragedy. It is an undeniable and terrible stain on his record.
It's a very heavy reality to grapple with, but we have to move to the end of the war. May 1945, VE Day. The crowds are cheering Churchill on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. He is the savior of the free world. And then, what, 2 months later? July 1945, a general election?
And one of the greatest political shocks in British history, the British public votes him out of office in a landslide. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, wins a huge majority.
Why? I mean, why fire the hero who just won the war?
Because the war was over. And the British soldiers and workers coming home, they didn't want to go back to the mass unemployment and poverty of the 1930s. They wanted a national health service. Yeah. They wanted decent housing. They wanted jobs. They saw Churchill as a magnificent warlord, but they didn't trust him to build the peace. They saw Labour as the party of social reform.
Churchill didn't exactly help himself during the election campaign either.
No, he really didn't. He made this bizarre, infamous speech where he claimed that a socialist Labour government would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo to enforce its policies.
Accusing the other side of being Nazis.
To accuse Clement Attlee, this quiet, modest, deeply patriotic man, of being a Nazi was just ridiculous. A lot of voters felt Churchill had completely lost the plot.
So he's out. He's not done. A year later, 1946, he travels to Fulton, Missouri.
He travels there with President Truman, and he gives a speech at Westminster College, the Sinews of Peace speech. This is where he warns the world that the Soviet Union is not a friend. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he says, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
He effectively declares the start of the Cold War before anyone else is willing to admit it's happening.
He was the very first major statesman to say it out loud, in public. He laid the intellectual foundation for the policy of containment and the creation of NATO. Even out of office, he was still shaping global strategy for decades to come.
And incredibly, he gets back in 1951. He becomes prime minister again at the age of 76.
It was a final hurrah, but he wasn't the same man. We know now he'd already suffered a series of small strokes which were kept secret from the public. He was often tired, his energy was fading.
What was his focus in that second term?
His main focus, ironically for a man so associated with war, was peace. He was terrified of the new hydrogen bomb. He desperately wanted a summit with the new Soviet leaders after Stalin's death to try and prevent nuclear Armageddon.
And domestically.
He was surprisingly moderate. He accepted the welfare state and the National Health Service that the Labor Party had built. He made no attempt to dismantle it. He governed as a one-nation conservative. His government's biggest achievement was building over 300,000 new houses a year to deal with the post-war housing crisis.
Finally, in 1955, at the age of 80, he resigns for good.
He retires to Chartwell. He paints. He finishes his massive History of the English-Speaking Peoples, and he slowly fades. He died on January 24th, 1965.
And the date is significant.
It's incredibly significant. It was exactly 70 years to the day after his father, Lord Randolph, had died. Even in death, his life had this sense of almost scripted drama.
His state funeral was the last great imperial event of the British Empire.
The entire world stopped to watch. The cranes along the River Thames dipped their jibs in salute as his coffin passed by on a boat. It really felt like it wasn't just a funeral for a man, it was a funeral for an entire age.
So, after all this, after looking at the lonely boy, the brave soldier, the failed strategist, the brilliant orator, and the stubborn imperialist, what's the final takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is that history is fragile. We have this tendency to look back and think the Allied victory in World War II was somehow inevitable. It was not. In 1940, it was profoundly unlikely.
And that brings me to the provocative thought I want to end on. Just imagine for a moment. Churchill was hit by a taxi in New York in 1931 and almost died. What if he had? Or imagine he had a heart attack in 1939 before the war really started. How will he be remembered today?
He would be remembered as a brilliant failure, a talented, fascinating man who ultimately got every major decision wrong. The man responsible for the Gallipoli disaster, the man who wrecked the British economy with the gold standard, the racist who screamed about India. He would be a cautionary tale, a historical footnote.
It was only the specific, unique catastrophe of 1940 that turned all of his flaws into virtues. His stubbornness suddenly became resolve. His obsession with history gave him perspective. His belligerence, his love of war, became exactly the courage the world needed at that moment.
Precisely. The world broke in a way that perfectly fit the shape of Winston Churchill. He didn't really change. The context changed around him to make him, for a brief time, absolutely necessary.
If you enjoy this deep dive into one of history's most complex and controversial figures, you are going to love the other biographies we have planned. We're looking at doing deep dives on Napoleon, on Caesar, and on FDR in the near future. So make sure you are subscribed to History Titans so you don't miss those.
And we want to know what you think. Let us know in the comments. Is the great man theory of history real? Was Churchill a unique genius who bent the world to his will? Or was he just a flawed man who was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right terrible time?
We would love to hear your take. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.